like so many people, have been deeply, deeply moved, deeply troubled about the fire that struck Maui 2.5 weeks ago. It's been very much on my mind. I've been wanting to speak about it. It's been very hard to digest, and to be honest, every time I approach the topic, it just kind of overwhelms me. And at the same time, now I have a platform, and albeit a small channel, but if what I have to offer this conversation helps in any way, then it's worth me putting my thoughts out there. Um, my heart really goes out to the people of Hawaii that are suffering through this really horrible, horrific tragedy. And I've seen a lot of videos and read a lot of articles that are pointing to something far beyond natural causes for this, and far beyond government negligence, and something far more sinister. So this video is not going to try to repeat that. This video is going to focus on similarities, commonalities that I've found between my research into urban fires of a previous reset in our nation's history in the late 1800s, early 1900s, with the urban fires that took out old world buildings, previous iterations of cities that we know almost nothing about because it is really not in our history books. And I put this image behind me because this is Seattle's Front Street before the fire of 1889. In addition to it being a photograph of exquisite buildings, ornate masonry structures, it's really one of the most damning photos that I've come across, because the story in city after city, Chicago, Boston, Cincinnati, I mean, pick a city in the United States and you're going to find this rinse and repeat type formula, giving a kind of cartoonish backstory to how a fire started, that the city itself was a tinderbox built out of matchsticks, and old frontier towns that were just waiting to go up in smoke previous to any fire codes or established fire departments. And so these hapless settlers were just building ramshackle structures from trees that they were busy milling down. And and then another aspect of the story, which is appearing to repeat itself in our current age, is that these cities were better off for these fires ripping through them and incinerating them, because now they had a chance to rebuild and make the city shiny and new again. Now in Seattle, the cartoonish backstory was that a glue pot spilled over in a wood shop, and in Chicago it was old Miss O'Leary's cow kicking over a lantern. In St. John's, Newfoundland, Canada, it was a pipe dropped in Timothy O'Brien's stable. Now, I'm starting to sniff something out about the Irish here not really being wanted around, so they're being laid blame for entire cities being burned down. In New York City, in Lower Manhattan, in one of the three fires that torched the business district during the 1800s, it was a ball of burning yarn that was thrown out of a window by a child. Burned down a city for the third time in New York in the 1800s. And another example is Jacksonville, Florida in 1901. 2,368 structures in just in the downtown were incinerated because sparks coming out of a chimney ignited a pile of Spanish moss. Now, that formula of just the downtown being consumed in these urban conflagrations of the late 1800s and early 1900s is something that just comes up again and again and again, to the point where I have really had to pause and wonder how is it that in these city fires, beyond the fact that the only one we ever learned about in school was Chicago, and beyond the fact that almost every major city in the United States and up into Canada was burned down at one time or another, you have this really strange phenomena of the fires consuming the business districts, not unlike what took place in Lahaina. Another commonality is that it's written that unusually high winds strike at the time of the spark, and in Seattle, Ellensburg, and Spokane, all of which burned down in the summer of 1889, which itself is curious and worthy of further investigation. There were reports of unusually high wind gusts. And of course, in Lahaina, there were reports of hurricane wind gusts, but I think many of us have seen the aerial imagery of Hurricane Dora 600 miles to the south of the Hawaiian Islands when it passed.
There's been a lot of attribution given to the Hurricane Dora, but I really don't think that this hurricane has had anything to do with the winds here. Here's where the storm is now. It's a powerful hurricane. It's a Category 4 hurricane, but here are where the islands are. And yeah, right now the storm is moving away, and the closest this storm got was 600 miles. So I really don't think this played much in the way of a role at all in the winds.
And so it really, it's left a lot of questions as to where these winds were originating. And the thing about Seattle, Ellensburg, and Spokane all burning down within 1 month of each other. Seattle was June 6th, Ellensburg was July 4th, and Spokane was August 4th, all in the summer of 1889. I'll get further into that curious situation as we proceed. One of the biggest commonalities, most important things that I discovered in looking into this was the disruption of the emergency command structure. And what I mean by that is, in Seattle, it's written that the fire chief happened to be out of town the day of the fire. Now, fire departments are paramilitary organizations. They respond to a hierarchical structure, command structure. You get a command from the top and you carry it out at the bottom. Much like the military, it is paramilitary. And so if the fire chief is out of town that the day the city burns down, the mayor steps in to make the calls. And of course, this is what happened in Seattle in 1889, but of course the mayor is not knowledgeable in the arts of fire suppression. So Seattle's mayor at that time made the decision to dynamite buildings to create fire breaks, which is a curious practice. If you look up the Boston fire I believe that was in 1866, thereabouts. There again, the formula repeats itself. Dynamite was used to blow up buildings to create fire breaks, but they admit that the dynamited buildings were actually spreading fires and sending burning cinders onto the roofs of other buildings. So if that was true for Boston, I would imagine that was true for Seattle. And if that was true at all, I would imagine that fire chiefs would be aware that that is actually going to be the result of blowing up masonry buildings in a dense urban setting, that what you're going to invariably do is spread fire and not stop it. I would love to hear from firefighters, fire chiefs that are out there that have anything to add to that discussion. But the emergency command structure being disrupted is something that repeated itself in Lahaina. In Lahaina, Herman Andaya, Maui's emergency operations chief, was not only did he decide not to sound the sirens, but he decided not to sound the emergency sirens from Waikiki.
Had we sounded the siren that night, we're afraid that people would have gone Malka. And if that was the case, then they would have gone into the fire. And so that is the reason why our protocol has been to use WEA and EAS. By the way, I should also note that there are no sirens Malka or on the mountainside where the fire was spreading down. So even if we sounded the siren, it would not have saved those people on the mountainside, Malka.
He happened to be out at a conference in Waikiki the day of the fire and didn't return until after. And Andaya, interestingly, had no background in disaster management when he beat 40 other contenders for the job when he was hired in 2017. Now, 2017 is an auspicious year in this story because this is also the year that Maui Police Chief John Pelletier was still incident commander in Las Vegas at the mass shooting at the country music concerts. Suffice to say that the command structure issue is of paramount importance when discerning what happened and what didn't happen in Lahaina 2.5 weeks ago. Another common thread is the low death count. And here again, the formulaic portrayal of urban fires in the United States in the late 1800s and early 1900s is that the death counts were very, very low. In Seattle, the official death count was 0, despite upwards of 50 acres of downtown being incinerated. Now in Lahaina, part of why this video is so difficult to make and this issue is so difficult to speak to is that, to my understanding, the official count stands at about 115, and I've read reports of upwards of 1,300 or more still missing. And of course, many of you have already heard the stories of the schools being closed and the children being sent home due to the high winds, and in Lahaina sent to their sure death. And my heart absolutely goes out to those families. Now, continuing, it wasn't just their business district wiped out, it was also their historical, cultural center. And as I understand it, the home of the last king and queen of Hawaii. And the similarities to Seattle there are also, to me, very uncanny, because I've talked about this in previous videos, which I invite you to go watch, where, for instance, the Seattle regrades, which leveled downtown and paved the way for modern iteration of Seattle, just completely obliterated what was there. And this is after the fire of 1889, in the early 1900s, all the way up until 1930. Millions of cubic yards of earth were removed from hills upon which were exquisite architectural marvels, and those were disappeared. The land was terraformed, and the earth was dumped into the tidal flats of the Duwamish River, which was turned into a shipping canal and an industrial port, erasing the memory of what was there before, the natural history and the cultural legacy of that land. I mentioned the Seattle, Ellensburg, and Spokane fires all happening in the summer of 1889, back to back to back. Well, it just so happened that a convention opened in what was then the Washington Territory in May of 1889. A convention for statehood opened and went on for about 6 months. And Washington was a holdout territory, and there was a lot of resistance to joining the Union. And the federal government, based out of Washington, D.C., had other ideas on what Washington's fate would be. And just so happened that three very important cities in Washington were incinerated months after the convention opened up, and by November, Washington had become a state. Now that echoes very much in what is going on in Lahaina, where there's been many reports of the local population not wanting to sell their ancestral properties and land to the land grabbers. And it also happens, and it's also been widely reported, that there was a smart city conference in Hawaii just this last January. Hawaii has been in the crosshairs of the World Economic Forum to introduce its new reset agenda. Just looking through the website promoting this, I mean, you try to look this up, you try to Google it, and it's just nothing but fact checks and deny. But you look at their actual website, and it talks about artificial intelligence in government, smart and connected cities, and digital communities, and all of this. So it's unfortunately very real, and so it does cast a particular light on unfortunate events going on in Maui. Another similarity between Seattle and not just Seattle, but again, many of the cities that burned down during our earlier reset epoch. It was written that water pumps were suddenly not working. There was no water pressure for one reason or another, so the fire departments could not fight the blazes. And this was true in both Seattle and Spokane in the cases of Washington. And of course, widely reported is that there was a decision made not to divert water to the firefighters battling the blaze, or to turn off water that had been diverted. Now, in many of the photographs of the devastation in Seattle after the fires of 1889, you see these, black hats, we call them, which appear to be bankers and insurance companies showing up at the scene of the crime. Of course, in Lahaina, too, you have reports of land grabbers showing up almost immediately before the cinders are even cool from their fire, harassing locals and offering them dimes on the dollar for their ancestral properties. And it's heartening to hear, and I hope that it continues as much of a hardship as it is, that locals are refusing to sell. And that's a really good sign of perhaps where things may be headed. The story is ours to write. There's no predetermined outcome here. And again, one other thing that I wanted to point out, and I find this to be very, very important, this is more of a curiosity, maybe just an echo of history, is that I mentioned that this photograph behind me is of what was Seattle's Front Street. And now in Lahaina, of course, we have images of cars being trapped on Front Street, unable to exit because the police were putting up roadblocks and obstructions and not allowing families to escape.
Important documents.
Evacuating city with crazy shit flying everywhere, fire embers. Gets night and day. In 10 seconds, it's dark, like the night.
In their cars, which were then incinerated, and we've seen many photos of melted aluminum. And people pointed at that melted aluminum, wheels melting off, engine blocks melting, as an indication of a heat source much hotter than burning wood. And there's a lot of back and forth about that. And of course, the mainstream fact checkers will hone in on something like that and point out that aluminum burns at 1200 plus degrees, whereas a forest fire can burn at 1400 plus degrees. So a fire conflagration of the sort that took out Lahaina would be capable of burning aluminum without the need of direct energy weapons, as they've been referred to. But I decided to look into this a little bit further, and so if a forest fire the source that I found says that a forest fire up to 1 meter, so this would be a grass fire, let's say sweeping across a savanna or something, would be 1472 degrees, whereas a forest inferno of up to 50 meters, 150 feet, would burn at almost 2200 degrees. So again, hot enough to burn aluminum. But what this made me reconsider was some of the things that have come up in my research are items like melted brick. Now, specifically, Stadium High School in Tacoma, another city in Washington State, suffered an inferno of its own in 1889. Now, I'll throw an image up of Stadium High School. It looks an awful lot like a castle. I've talked about that in some previous videos. Ostensibly was started as a hotel, and then due to the economic depression of 1893, it was just abandoned, and then it was picked up in the early 1900s after it burned down, and it was converted into a high school. But I went on a tour of Stadium High School in 2020, and because it was on lockdown due to COVID restrictions, I wasn't able to get in. But our tour guide, who's a Tacoma historian, told us about the melted bricks that can still be seen in the attic. And so I looked up, what temperature does brick melt at? And I came up with over 4,500 degrees. So the hottest forest fire, 2,200 degrees, is not even half the temperature which would be required to melt brick. So it begs the question of what the hell would the heat source be to melt the bricks in the attic of Stadium High School? And returning to Seattle, just in doing this research this afternoon, I looked up the Wikipedia article on Seattle's fire, and when you know it, they have an image of melted ceramic plates that fused together that were recovered from the fire in 1889. And I looked up the temperature to melt ceramic, and this is, ceramic that's already fired, not the actual firing process to create ceramic, but it would take over 3,600 degrees to melt ceramic. So again, the hottest forest fire, 2,200 degrees, 3,600 degrees to melt ceramic, 4,500 plus degrees to melt brick. And that brings us right back to the question of what in the world could have caused such intense heat in these urban fires during an earlier reset period in the United States. And I wonder if this provides any clues, if not answers. Definitely points to some very compelling, if disturbing, questions as to what could have possibly caused the inferno that incinerated Lahaina in 2023.
So where I'm at right now, just to orientate you, you can see the lights for the football stadium right there at Lahaina Luna. So we're right below Lahaina Luna High School in the neighborhood that did not, I repeat, did not burn. You can see all these houses are standing around here, unburned. There's no burn here, okay? So to me, this is like something out of a space movie, because you have this small field with some grass that burned, right? You can see where the grass burned. But then you have these two vehicles sitting in here that have melted
it's
aluminum. So Donovan, if you want to just take us through this car real quick and show us, I know you know a few things about cars, you can point out some things that require a very high temperature. By the way, we just talked to the neighbor who was talking to an investigator in Lahaina town yesterday, and he said the investigator told him the temperatures reached in excess of 3,000 degrees. So tell us what you got, Donovan.
Well, we have about 300 degrees for aluminum, and this
300?
1,300.
1,300, okay, thank you.
1,300, well 1220, but if you round it up, because it was not only melted, it was liquefied to the point where it became a river of aluminum going down the dirt hill.
So this is the aluminum rim, obviously. There's the tire, what's left of it, the steel threads or steel belts.
And maybe combination gas tank if the gas tank's aluminum.
Okay, okay. So you have liquefied aluminum running down the side of a grass fire.
You have the windows that were melted, the back window. If you look at the big old, almost like...
The glass is just melted.
Yeah, it was
dripping.
This is almost what you would see if you put a car in an incinerator.
But this is not surrounded by a bunch of structure fires or anything.
Yeah, there's no fuel.
So besides the gas that was in the tank, what's your theory on what could create temperatures of this level in the middle of a field?